In episode 53 of the Mindfulness and Grief podcast, Faith Wilcox shares her new grief memoir, Hope is a Bright Star, and talks about writing and finding comfort and peace after the death of a child. The Mindfulness and Grief podcast is brought to you by Awaken, my meditation for grief program that helps you cope with the heartache and pain of loss with mindfulness-based practices for your body, mind, and spirit. Join Awaken to participate in weekly meditation for grief groups. Access the complete mindfulness and grief course library that features guided meditations and streaming video, and connect with people who understand what you're going through in our live sessions. Grief is hard enough. You don't have to do it alone. Learn more and join the community at meditationforgrief.com. I am your host, Heather Stang, author of Mindfulness and Grief and the guided journal From Grief to Peace. If you find this podcast helpful, please click on the subscribe button so you'll be notified of future episodes. And leave a review so other people can find the Mindfulness and Grief podcast and benefit from the teachings. Faith Fuller Wilcox believes that self-expression through writing leads to healing. Her writing is reflective of a growing body of medical research about narrative identity, which illuminates that how we make sense of what happens to us and the meaning we give to our experiences beyond our control directly impact our physical and psychological outcomes. Faith learned these truths firsthand when her 13-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, was diagnosed with a rare bone cancer that took her life. Faith's journey from grief and despair to moments of comfort and peace taught her life-affirming lessons, which she shares today through her writing. Faith is the author of Hope is a Bright Star, a mother's memoir of love, loss, and learning to live again. Faith is also the author of Facing into the Wind, a mother's healing after the death of her child, a book of poetry. Faith also leads a journal writing program at Mass General Hospital for Children, for patients and their families, and designed to give participants the opportunity to express themselves, alleviate stress, celebrate victories, and honor their grief. So welcome to today's episode of the Mindfulness and Grief podcast. And I'm honored and, excited is not like a word we use so much in grief. It's not that we're excited. I'm excited about that. I'm excited to learn about how Faith is using writing to help other people. But before we dive into that, I want to give you an opportunity to share with the listeners, what brings you here, what your story is, your journey.
Of course, thank you very much for having me. In the year 2000, my daughter Elizabeth was 13. She was complaining of some pain in her right knee. I took her to the doctor, and he thought that perhaps she was having growing pains because she had grown from 5'6" to 5'9" in just a year. And he thought that maybe that was the cause of the problem. She had also complained about some pain in her chest or her lungs when she was swimming, but he didn't have an idea about what that could be about. About 6 weeks later, her knee area was certainly causing her pain. And so I took her to an orthopedic doctor on a Friday, and he said he'd get back to us on Monday. Well, Monday morning, early in the morning, we got a call from her pediatrician, not from the orthopedic doctor, who said that we needed to go into the hospital tomorrow and we needed to have an appointment with a specialist, and she will probably need to have an MRI done of her knee. I was very confused because it wasn't the orthopedic doctor who called me back. It was my pediatrician, and I didn't know what the next doctor's appointment was going to be about. When we arrived at the hospital, I saw on the placard orthopedic oncology, and I was absolutely blown away. And I stood in front of the placard so that my daughter wouldn't see that said orthopedic oncology. But when I was in the office, I saw that many people were having quite a big difficulty. Sometimes they had a leg amputated. Sometimes they had a neck brace on. I knew this was a place that was serious. Over the next several days, Elizabeth had CAT scans and MRIs, and one operation. It was a small surgery to remove a piece of bone from her knee to see if they could find out what was going on. By the end of the week, we knew that she had osteosarcoma, which is a very rare kind of pediatric bone cancer. We also knew rapidly, we're learning things rapidly, that it was in a very aggressive form of childhood cancer. Elizabeth had 10 months of intensive chemotherapy. At the time, she'd be in the hospital usually for a week at a time because the chemotherapy left her so exhausted and her cell counts were so low. But yet during this time, she also managed to keep her humor, to keep her emotional strength. Of course, she had bad days, but she had a way of looking at the positive side of world. And it changed me enormously to see my child, who sometimes had previously been shy, to seem to gain another strength. One example of that is she went into rooms of children who had just recently been admitted into the hospital, and she explained procedures to them in a way that a child could understand. The following day, I received people coming down the hall and talking with me and the parents saying that Elizabeth made such a difference to them with her winning smile and letting the kids know as best she could explain things in a way that a child would understand. And she became sort of the greeter of the floor. After 10 months, her cancer kept growing. Tumors were incredibly sadly throughout her body at this point. She had some radiation. And then 3 weeks before she died, she told me that she wanted to have hospice care. She said she had tried so hard for nearly 1 year. And she said to me, "It feels like I'm going on a trip. I just don't know where I'm going." And 365 days after she was diagnosed, she died in my arms.
And how were you doing during that time? Because I think it's helpful for people who are going through it now to hear how somebody else felt then.
Do you mean at the time of her death, or do you mean during her period of illness?
I think I mean all of it.
All of it, okay. Well, I did have a great deal of shock to start with. One never thinks about a cancer diagnosis, especially with a child, and especially with an active child. And so I had a great deal of shock. I had a great deal of anxiety. I lost 25 pounds in about 6 weeks. And I just had this sort of restless energy inside. Even though sometimes I would fall asleep exhausted, I'd then wake up at like 1 a.m. and stare at the ceiling till 4 a.m. when maybe I got a little bit more sleep. In time, I learned, it might sound strange, but sort of a new normal. And our new normal was going to the hospital on a very regular basis. And my new normal was seeing Elizabeth in a wheelchair and very weak. And my new normal was starting to get to know the doctors and the nurses and actually feeling comfortable being on the hospital floors, because everything wasn't so new. Everything wasn't just getting thrown at us. We more or less understood what the treatments were like. what we could anticipate. I think initially we had no idea what to anticipate, and that really threw both of us. Elizabeth had one experimental treatment, and we were both thrilled that she could have it, but sadly it was a little bit too late to help her. So I think those times were marked by some deal of anxiety, some deal of restlessness, certainly sleeplessness, certainly lack of appetite. After she died, there was just a time when I found it very hard to put one foot in front of the other. The smallest of tasks were just very, very difficult to do. So if I went to the grocery store, it was really hard just to go by sometimes her favorite thing, like the little bite brownies, and I would just leave my grocery cart and run out of the store crying. I wasn't really very able to cope very well. So in time, really years of time, I was very supported by my family and by my friends and by a therapist. And I started to make some connections and to know that the world does continue, does go on. And that in time, I learned that I could hold joy and I could hold sorrow. And I would be the same person, but the joy and the sorrow could both exist in my life at the same time.
And there are probably a lot of people listening who are wondering how we get to that point. So what was the most helpful thing? You listed a lot of supports, both in terms of people and attitude, but what was the most helpful thing for you, do you think? If there was any one thing, because sometimes it's a bunch of things, right?
I think it really was a bunch of things. One, which we'll talk about, is I started to write when Elizabeth was ill. I started to write about my hopes and my dreams. I wrote about my anxiety. I wrote about things that I kept trapped inside that I didn't want to say out loud. I also wrote about the treatments that she was receiving because honestly, it just felt like a tsunami of information was coming at me. And I would have to write things down because your mind is very affected with shock, and I just couldn't remember everything. So if I wrote things down, it helped me to understand, and I could go back and ask the doctor or nurse about a procedure or what type of chemotherapy she was getting, what the hopeful outcomes were. So writing was a very important part of my life, and I continued to write after my daughter died. Again, I wrote about everything that was going on, whether I was having a moderately okay day, whether I was having a horrible day, what I did that maybe made me feel a little bit better during the day. Some other things that I did is I actually went on a silent retreat, and it was at an Episcopalian monastery in a beautiful setting with an 18th century house on about 100 acres of land next to a wide tidal river. And I walked along the river a lot. And the brothers didn't speak, but they were very loving and they had a very, very loving presence. And I found that to be very healing. I'm very drawn to nature, and walking in the woods or swimming in a lake or walking by the sea definitely was restorative to me. And being with some of my girlfriends was definitely restorative to me. So I started to emphasize doing the things that made me feel better, which was definitely being in nature, being with my friends, going on silent retreats, writing, and actually gardening helped me a lot too. I love being in the earth.
I have a lot of people around me and in the mindfulness and grief community and Awaken, myself included, who just find gardening to be one of the most healing practices. There's something about seeing something go from seed to fruit and getting your hands dirty, even digging the dirt out under your nails when you're done, to me is very therapeutic.
It is, and you can see little by little what you've grown, what you've planted, and watch it grow. and just know that life goes on, even in the simplest of ways.
Yeah, it's a metaphor for so many things we go through. I want to kind of go back to that idea of a silent retreat, spending time in nature. So many people, when grief strikes or when a life-limiting diagnosis is given, well, a lot of times when you get the diagnosis, you're very busy with the care, right? The going back and forth to the hospital and being with your person. And then all that just stops suddenly. And that role of caregiver goes away, which can be abrupt and kind of jarring. And then there's, for some, I'm not saying for everybody, but there can be this tendency to want to stay busy or feel like you need to stay busy because the silent pockets of time are scary. And I'm wondering for you, was it that you already had kind of a practice of being able to be in that spaciousness? Or is that something you developed?
I think a bit of both. I always, since I was a child, found being in nature to be restorative. So my long walks or my walks with my golden doodle dog were part of my life before. But I probably went on more walks and sought that out more regularly. And certainly going on a silent retreat was something new for me. Writing was something I had done a fair amount in college, but I had never done journal writing on a regular basis. And so that was very, very helpful for me. All those activities are inward activities, and I often turn inward for strength. And so I think I had to learn how to do that more. And that helped me along my way.
How did you decide to pick up a journal?
Actually, it was my therapist who encouraged me to, because I think he also felt that I was keeping an awful lot inside, and that sometimes if you can just put something down on paper, it takes a weight off your chest. So it can be very, very helpful that way.
Yeah, it feels like a release valve sometimes. All that stuff you're bottling up. Like, I know for me, if I'm holding stuff inside, I kind of feel like a balloon almost sounds too spacious and pleasant. It's more like just an overstuffed sausage, emotionally, where it's, and that externalizing it can put you in the role of witness and also the role of someone who's just releasing.
Right.
Yeah.
That's really true.
And so now you help others, right? Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. Several years ago, I wanted to do something to help parents and children who were struggling as Elizabeth and I struggled now almost 20 years ago. And I approached the hospital where Elizabeth was cared for at Mass General Hospital for Children. And I asked if I could begin a journal writing program. I knew that journaling was very helpful for many of the reasons that we have described. And I thought if I could encourage parents to write, and if I could encourage older children to write, that perhaps they would be able to both express anxieties, but also celebrate the victories that they have along their path. And it could also be used when I talk to children about just perhaps they want to write a short story, perhaps they want to write about their favorite people, their favorite places, favorite times, in a way to draw their mind away from where they are in the hospital. So I approached what's called the Pediatric Family Advisory Council. I posed my idea. They thought about it and they asked to see some research. And I knew of a fair number of research projects that had been done showing that in one particular case where they interviewed parents who had been in a pediatric intensive care unit, they asked them to write for 15 minutes a day for up to a month. And there was a group of parents who wrote during that time, and there was a group of parents who didn't write during that time. And the group of parents who wrote had better psychological outcomes. And this outcome was repeated again and again. They had this very, very similar findings with parents in the neonatal intensive care unit and also for caregivers with their loved ones in intensive care units. And if you'd like to know more about some of the leaders in this field, I'm happy to tell you a little bit more. But once the physicians at Mass General Hospital for Children had seen some of the research, then they were very supportive of me starting this program. So I'd go in with journals on a Tuesday afternoon. And initially, I thought I would be meeting in the family room, but I found that parents really didn't like to leave their children, which I totally understand. So I go and I knock on the door, and if the timing is right, I go in and I talk to the children and I talk to the parents about the benefits of journal writing. I was able to do this just for about 15 months, and then COVID happened. And unfortunately, I had to stop. But in those 15 months, on Tuesdays, I talked to 785 people, and about 80% of them, people really, really wanted to write. So in my absence, the program's been picked up by the pediatric intensive care unit and the neonatal intensive care unit, and nurses, social workers, child life specialists, and spiritual care providers are now offering the journals to parents and offering the journals to adolescent children. And I'm really happy that it's continued on. I'm looking forward to the time when I can go back in, but most hospitals, including Mass General, has very few volunteers in at this time.
So I have a question. You're going in and helping these children and these mothers in a very similar way that your daughter would go in and sit and explain things with clarity, and it sounds like a lot of compassion. So did she influence you, or did you influence her, or was it a two-way street?
You know, it's interesting. That comparison has been brought up to me just once before, and I hadn't really thought about it prior to that. But Elizabeth developed a lot of compassion in her life, and I guess I've developed a lot of compassion in my life too, after having gone through all that I've gone through. And it is really in the giving that I can find some peace inside. It also helps me to remember Elizabeth. It's not that it's always easy for me, particularly if there's an adolescent who was Elizabeth's age and who has a winning smile and often makes me think about her. Sometimes that's a little startling for me. But other times, if I know that I've helped even a few parents or even a few children on an afternoon, that is very, very rewarding.
I imagine with 785 people you approached and 80% saying they want to do it, you've helped more than a few.
That's true.
I know my mom, the mathematician, if she's listening to this, is like, you need to figure out what the 80% number is, but we're just not going to do that on the podcast right now. But I think that's a striking parallel. And so often, when a loved one dies, we pick up some of those values, or of course, in a parent-child, you may have modeled that, but I think it's a beautiful connection that's remaining. And, I know you said it's not easy all the time. And I am the same way, when I'm working with someone who has a loss that's very similar to one of my losses, it's that recognizing what bubbles up and hurts inside, because just because we're helping other people doesn't mean we aren't still carrying our own heartache. So
that's very true.
So what do you do in those moments for coping or self-care when you approach someone that reminds you of her and you're feeling that emotion?
At that time, while I'm in the room, I'm able to continue on. But what I have done is I've often gone back, taken a little break. I go back to the family room and just sort of sit still for 5 minutes or so. If often that is enough to help me and get me going again. But if that's not enough, I go down down to the cafeteria, and I might just get a little something that I like to eat, get a little drink, feel a little refreshed, and then go back up to the floor. So essentially, I have a little time out, just a little quiet time to get centered again.
And sometimes a little snack, which can be
Yes.
very centering and grounding. Another question that I wanted to invite you to explore for our listeners is, Elizabeth has an older sister, and so she was going through her loss as well. How did you navigate that as a mother?
Yes, it was very difficult because one never has practice for this, and there is actually very little written about how to cope with an adolescent child who has had a significant loss. And I really had to take it day by day. Olivia was at the point where she had just started a new high school, which was much bigger than her previous middle school. So she had new people to meet. Of course, being an adolescent, she wanted to fit in sort of the best that she could, but she felt that her experiences were so very different. It took her quite a while to find friends that were able to be empathic with her. And sometimes she would get awfully upset when kids would just complain about really stupid, mundane things like the hamburger was overcooked. You know, she'd just shake her head and say, how can I possibly relate to these people? They just don't understand. But in time, she made friends, and often her friends had already gone through something kind of big in their life, like losing a parent. So they understood better. There were days and times when Olivia and I grieved together. And then there were times when we grieved apart. I believe that Olivia didn't really want to let me into her full life, which is also very normal of a teenager. It's also a time when teenagers start to pull away from home. So she spent a lot of time once she'd made some good friends. And it was honestly very difficult. I believe there's no roadmap of how this is going to work out well. And all I would say is just keep trying. If something you're trying is not working out well, then try something else. We ended up liking swimming together. We ended up liking gardening together, going to movies together. But there were many times in our day-to-day life where we had some separate paths that we chose.
And as you said, that's normal for a teenager to not let a parent in, and understanding where your child is developmentally can be really helpful for grief. And I think you really hit the nail on the head. I want to say, with there is no roadmap. But I'm glad that the two of you were able to find some activities that sound like they're really restorative, so you could continue your relationship together. And maybe, I'm thinking about things like swimming and movies and stuff that kind of gives you space to not necessarily be in intense talking, which I've talked to parents who've tried that route with teenagers and in grief and non-grief. And sometimes you need that parallel activity to kind of warm it up and create the space. How is she doing now?
That's very true.
Yeah.
I think it's very true. I won't say easier, but our relationship was easier if we weren't in an intense talk while we were doing an activity.
Yeah. And then those can occur naturally rather than be forced, which is good advice for anybody you're in a relationship with. So can we circle back a minute to journaling? And for people who have never picked up a journal or even thought about it, or who are downright afraid of writing, because there's a lot of that, even for those of us who are writers some days. How do you help someone slide into this practice when they're going through a really difficult time?
I would say just to try. There are many things when you're grieving, it's a good idea just to try and to see how it feels to you. So I would go off someplace and I'd buy a journal that you really, really appeals to you. It's either a beautiful design, or you like the texture of the journal, or you like the size of the journal, just something that you know that you would like to pick up. Like sometimes you have a favorite book, just something that you'd like to pick up and like to write in. And then I try to set aside 10 to 15 minutes a day. I think sometimes writing can seem overwhelming because you think you have to write for an hour or maybe a half an hour and have to dedicate a lot of time to it. And the research that is done, even 15 minutes a day, 5 days a week, was found to be very, very beneficial. And if you don't have 15 minutes a day, write 10 minutes a day, 3 times a week. Just start the process. And you might find that you get into a pattern of you like writing first thing in the morning, or you like writing before you go to sleep. I liked writing before I went to sleep. I found it to be calming. And also I could look out over the day. Another thing that I would do is write in different places. You don't have to just write at a desk. You can write outside at a chair. You can write under an umbrella. You can write next to your garden. You can go on a hike and bring your journal and write while you're in the hike, and you might be inspired by the beauty that surrounds you. And know that you don't have to write about the subject of your loved one's illness. You can write about the beauty of the world. You can write about work that went well or work that didn't go so well. You can write about family relationships. You could make up a short story. There are lots and lots of things that you can do. You don't have to feel tied that you have to have a certain subject to start this process. One other thing that I do and encourage is that people use writing prompts. You can find some writing prompts on my website if you want to mention that. Or you can take your favorite passages from a song, or a favorite passage from a book, or something you found or heard in a movie that you thought was terrific, and just start writing. Put your pen to the paper and just write. And you might find that, I've done this before, I had 4 or 5 lines of the words just right before something started to unfold within me, and then I would take off after that. And the passages don't have to deal with illness or recovery or grieving or healing. Your passages might be something inspirational, and you can write about that inspirational thought. And then probably in time, your subject is going to turn to the one that's foremost in your mind.
You know, that just right, just right, just right. I've replicated that a few thousand times in my life. And, you know, the timing piece. One of my favorite writing books is Natalie Goldberg's Writing Down the Bones. That was the first
Me too.
First journaling or first writing book I ever read. I don't even remember. Was it published in 1983, I think, originally, or something like that? Still one of the best books. And I'd love to hear in a few minutes, maybe some of want to talk about your books, and then also maybe you said some leaders in the field. But one thing that I learned quickly from reading her book was the importance of timing, like a timed writing exercise. That doesn't mean you have to stop at 15 minutes, but just like with everything, having a deadline can really put your nose to the grindstone. I mean, I even do like 15-minute straightening sprints in my house that turn into an hour. But if I told myself I was going to set aside an hour to clean, I'm never going to do it. And it's very similar with writing as well. And I'm really glad that you brought up writing prompts, because sometimes staring at a blank page is overwhelming. And while the suggestion for many journal teachers is to just write something, even if it's I don't know what to write, or just write, those journaling prompts can help move you forward. And I have those in From Grief to Peace and my new guided journal, and you have some on your website. And possibly, do you have some in your book or not? I know you've got a couple. You've got poetry and you have your memoir.
I do not have writing prompts in
the book. Okay, so we'll go to your website for writing prompts. So one thing I've learned for myself, there are never enough writing prompts in the world. Like once
You could you can also just Google writing prompts and get some ideas.
there's tons out there. And one exercise that I do I have a thing called a 12-minute warm up that I do, where you do like 1 minute writing, 1 minute writing, 1 minute writing, 3 minutes of making a list about something in particular, and then you pick one thing from that list, and that's your writing prompt. There's a lot of, you can write your own or use them, but and there's some research that shows for grief, and this is one study that people who were given writing prompts tended to have a better psychological outcome than those who didn't. I think that for me, I like to have both, like a guided journal or use writing prompts and have a spiral bound notebook that's just my free form. Like, I like it all. It's all
right. I didn't mention, but there are guided journals out there if that's something that would help sort of spur you on. Certainly, your guided journals are very available as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of them. I found out after putting mine out just how many there are. And now I want to buy all of them. I need a separate house for it. So let's talk about your memoir.
Of course. What I really write about is Elizabeth's courage and her strength. I also am very honest about the really harsh days. I write about when we found good moments, but not necessarily had good days, and how you can find good moments in life. And after she died, I wrote about really our maelstrom of grief and how Olivia and I, sought together and sometimes apart, our own journeys for healing. I've mentioned many of the ways that the healing path I found. And I give examples during my memoir about how I slowly found moments and places of comfort and peace. I was also separated at the time of Elizabeth's illness, and I went to live with my sister. I needed to have a fresh start. I needed to be in an environment where I felt very supported and where I knew both of my daughters would be very supportive. In time, I met a man and fell in love and remarried, and I had the joy of now having stepchildren and of also having grandchildren to love and to adore and to look through life through their lens again and see all the wonder that they experience as they've been growing up. And I write about that as well. And at the end, I write about how I felt that you can recover from grief. There is hope, and one should always hold on to hope, even when you're having very, very difficult days. There is hope that you will find joy in life again. There's hope that you will feel better again. And the reality is you will always feel the pain of your loss. In time, that pain is much less acute than it was initially. But it doesn't mean you ever stop loving that person or ever stop wishing that they were with you. But it no longer disables you. And you can meet new people. You could return to work. You can try some new work, try some new ways to live your life. And you can have a full, rewarding, and rich life again.
It's space for all of the emotions.
Yes, space for all of the emotions.
And you also wrote a book of poetry.
I did.
Tell us.
I did. And that was, for me, the first way that I was able to express my thoughts really came out as poetry. I'd be happy to read a poem for you if you'd like.
I love that.
And that could help you sort of understand how I tied in the natural world. Where do I go from here? Where will I begin? My life is so changed from what it has been. Where do I start? Will I sit by a pond in the cool sunlight? Will I walk in the woods, which are anticipating spring? Will I hold my grieving daughter? Will I have lunch with friends and hear news of their families? Will I fold up my dark winter clothes and fill my drawers with the lighter clothes of spring? Perhaps I'll walk in an open, rough field, lined by stone walls, tall pine trees, and filled with whispering winds, where the light is bright and the shadows are few, large enough for all my memories to flow through, and where there is room for me to move. I will go into this field and step into something new, each step remembering, each step reconciling, each step guiding me toward a place I am longing to be.
And so that was from Facing into the Wind, a mother's healing after the death of her child. Thank you for reading
That's
that.
right.
Well, talk to us a little bit about your craftsmanship there.
Well, it's obviously a free form type of poetry. And what I found is that years ago, when I started to reread my journals, I was pulling out lines that where I felt that I could express myself and I could find some parallels with the natural world. And the natural world, as you know, is a process of living and a process of dying and a process of rebirth. And I could also see the eternal in the natural world. If you're by the sea and you watch the waves come rolling in and rolling in and rolling in, you know that we're part of something much larger than ourselves. And when I was writing my poems, when I writing my lines, I just kept referring to nature again and to looking to the eternal qualities of life. And it just flowed together. It wasn't that I sat out and said, today I'm going to write a poem. I was just starting to write stanzas, and it just flowed for me.
Much like the rivers in the ocean, natural. In your memoir, I wanted to mention the name of that, which I did at the beginning in the intro, but your memoir is Hope is a Bright Star, a mother's memoir of love, loss, and learning to live again, which, is it out yet? I mean, today we're in June. I know it's a June date.
It was published on June 8th.
Wow.
So yes, it's out.
All right. So where can people find your books? Where can they find you?
Yes, you can find me on my website at www.faithwilcox, WILCOX, narratives.com. My email is faith@faithwilcoxnarratives.com. You can find my book at Amazon. You can request it through your local independent bookstore. It's available at Barnes & Noble. It's available in print as an ebook, and also I have an audiobook if that's what you prefer. So it's available on Audible, but it's also available in many of the smaller audiobook vendors.
Wonderful. I always like to support the local independent bookstores. And
I do
and they
too.
can get whatever Amazon can get.
Absolutely.
You know, and often within a day, sometimes quicker than Amazon, depending on the book. So I wanted to just kind of give us some space at the end, first for me to thank you for this. I'm always just so grateful and happy to talk to other people who love journaling as much as I do. And I'm also grateful that you're willing to share this story of love and loss with the listeners. I think there's a lot that you offered that people can take away and put into practice, and also just to have some hope, because that is, I think, the most important thing to have. And I always say that just by doing something like listening to a podcast or picking up a journal, that's an action. It shows that you're doing something for yourself. So know that you're taking a step just by being here with us today. And so I wanted to give you some space. Is there anything else you want to share with the listeners that you think might be supportive to them on their grief journey?
I've mentioned this before, but holding on to hope is really important. Don't ever give up hope that your life can be better one day. And it never means that you're walking away from your loved one. Your loved one will be with you, will be inside you for the rest of your life. But life can be good again. And just hold on to hope.
Thank you so much, Faith.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening today. The show notes for episode 53 can be found at mindfulnessandgrief.com. Just click the podcast button, and there you will find the links to Faith's books and writing prompts. And while you are on the Mindfulness and Grief website, click the retreat button to learn how you can join me for a live, in-person grief retreat, Making Peace with Loss, at the Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York, October 1st through 3rd, 2021. I will be joined by Dr. Terry Daniel, author of Grief and God, and Dr. Donna Holland Barnes, author of The Truth About Suicide. You will discover how to tend to the pain of your loss and how to give yourself time and space to mourn so that you can care for your grieving body, integrate the reality of what happened, pick up the pieces, and re-engage with life in a healthy and meaningful way. Learn more at mindfulnessandgrief.com. Thank you for listening to the Mindfulness and Grief podcast. Please help us spread the word and subscribe to this podcast or even write a review. A special thank you goes to our podcast engineer, Todd Campbell of Hub City Recording, and to the Atomic Mosquitoes, who provide our theme music. This podcast is a service of the Mindfulness and Grief Institute. Visit us at mindfulnessandgrief.com to download your free copy of Navigating Grief and to learn more about our Awaken Meditation for Grief group and one-on-one support. I am your host, Heather Stang. May you find some peace in knowing you are not alone. And please be gentle with your grieving heart as you move through the rest of your day.